The Ice Age is here. While the world struggled to survive, one man was turning the frozen frontiers into his own kingdom. In the middle of an unrecognizable, frozen city, where every piece of infrastructure had collapsed and transportation had come to a complete standstill, he was rising. An urgent report crackled through the airwaves. Earth had officially entered a new Ice Age, and the shift was accelerating at an alarming pace. Out in the field, a brave correspondent battled the cold, his microphone freezing over with every passing second. He struggled to keep his voice steady as he warned the nation. Global temperatures were still plummeting, with no sign of stopping. Yet, even as frost clung to his lips, he urged the people not to lose hope. Clenching his fist, he projected confidence, declaring that the government had not abandoned its citizens. As long as they stood together, this strong nation would endure, just as it always had. But before he could continue his speech of unity and resilience, the sky split open with a deafening roar. A frozen airplane, battered by the relentless storm, came crashing down from above. It tore through the city, plowing straight into the reporter and his entire crew. The screen flickered as the last remaining news station in the country broadcast its final moments. Shaky footage of the wreckage, the overwhelming silence that followed, and then static. A man watched this from his dimly lit, ice-ridden apartment. The frozen screen in front of him was the last window to the outside world. And now even that was gone. Han Feng barely reacted. His room painted a picture of someone who had fought for survival, but had long since given up. Empty boxes, scattered supplies, and remnants of desperate attempts to stay warm cluttered the space. Near the entrance, what little food he had left sat untouched. There was no point anymore. Then a sound, a frantic knocking at the door, followed by a panicked voice calling his name over and over again. Han Feng barely moved at first, letting the noise blend into the background of the howling wind outside. But when the voice didn't stop, something in him stirred. With stiff limbs, he finally stood up from his miserable nest of blankets and debris. Grabbing a steel bat, modified with nails, dried blood still crusted on its surface, he moved toward the door. He was gaunt, wrapped in the thickest winter where he could scavenge, but even that did little to protect him from the unforgiving cold. Step by step, he approached the door, pressing his eye against the frost-covered peephole. What he saw made his breath hitch. A woman stood outside, bundled up in layers, but still shivering violently against the brutal wind. Her face was red from the cold, her body trembling uncontrollably. And yet, even through the layers of frost and time, Han Feng recognized her instantly. Before the Ice Age, he had known her well, and now she was here. Han Feng opened the door, his face slightly flushed. Standing outside was Li Hyona, and he had no idea what she was doing there. The world outside had turned into a dangerous, lawless wasteland. Yet here she was, right at his doorstep. Still holding the bat in his hand, he urged her to come inside where it was warmer and safer. Hyona didn't hesitate. She swung the door open wider and stepped into Han Feng's relatively safer room. But before he could even process what was happening, she grabbed him by the collar and crashed her lips onto his. The speed of her movement was so sudden that her little bonnet tumbled to the floor. Han Feng's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't pull back. If anything, his face turned an even deeper shade of red. The kiss was intense, deep, and passionate. Long enough that anyone watching might have thought the world wasn't crumbling outside. But hey, if the world was ending, might as well go out with a sloppy makeout session in the middle of an abandoned hallway, right? When they finally pulled apart, both were left gasping for breath, tongue still slightly out, spit still dribbling. Han Feng, still dazed, finally managed to ask what had gotten into her. Of all things, why kiss him the second he opened the door? Hyona, still catching her breath, confessed with trembling words. She had finally realized Han Feng was the man she truly loved. All this time, it had been him. Tears welled up in the corners of her expressive eyes as she admitted that he was the one she was meant to be with. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal a person's true feelings, to see who really cares, who will stand by you no matter how hard things get. And speaking of hard, Hyona wasn't done proving her point. Taking Han Feng's hands, she placed them directly against her chest, letting him feel how fast her heart was racing. She wasn't lying. She wanted to be with him, no matter what. Hearing the word anything was enough to erase any rational thought from Han Feng's brain. Any hesitation, any doubts gone. All the red flags that should have made him pause, they had just turned bright green. Hyona pressed her thighs against him, grinding slightly, pulling him in closer. He didn't stand a chance. The world might have been frozen over, supplies might have been running dangerously low, but right now, Han Feng was heating up like never before. And something else was definitely rising in the lower regions. As Hyona gently caressed his cheeks, he met her gaze, his heart pounding as hard as hers. With all the sincerity he could muster, he confessed that her words meant the world to him. The doorframe was definitely not the right place for this. Hyona gently shushed Han Feng, making sure he didn't say another word. Right now, all she wanted was for him to close his eyes and feel the moment. Against his logical mind, Han Feng obeyed, letting his eyelids fall shut. But curiosity got the better of him, and he asked what was supposed to happen next. That was when another presence made itself known. A man, gripping the doorframe ominously, had arrived unnoticed. Without hesitation, he swung the frozen door wide open, locked onto Han Feng's head, and with a brutal force, brought down a blunt weapon with pure killing intent. Han Feng never saw it coming. His skull caved in before he even realized what was happening. Blood splattered across the apartment entrance, painting the icy floor in crimson. Hyona stepped inside alongside the mystery man, her body trembling as she stuttered in shock. She hadn't expected things to turn so violent so quickly. Her partner scoffed at her reaction, unimpressed. She needed to stop playing innocent. She knew all along that this was the only way things could go. The world had gone to hell a long time ago. One less mouth to feed didn't change anything. But enough about the brutality. It was time to see what Han Feng had been hoarding. If they played their cards right, they might just get enough supplies to survive until rescue came. The real horror, however, was that Han Feng didn't die immediately. He lay on the freezing ground, his body trembling, his mind clouded with pain. The blood from his shattered skull spilled out, only to freeze the moment it hit the floor. His vision blurred, his thoughts a mess. He wasn't sure what had happened, only that he couldn't move. Was this it? Was he finally dying? He would finally know what it felt like to lose his life. Through the haze, he caught one last cruel sight. Hyona and the mystery man, barely a few meters away, making out like nothing had happened. The man's hands roamed over her in ways Han Feng had only dreamed of, whispering sweet promises of reward for the perfect performance she had put on to make this all possible. Hatred burned within him. Even as his vision darkened and his consciousness faded, the weight of betrayal pressed down unbearably heavy. If there was another life after this, he swore he would never be a lovesick fool again. Then there was nothing, but in that empty void, something strange happened. Tiny droplets of light began to appear. At first, just a speck, but then it grew, becoming brighter, more substantial. Han Feng stared in confusion. What the hell was happening? His very being felt strange. He subconsciously extended an arm, only to realize his skin was translucent, like he was something else entirely. The warm glow pulled him in, a stark contrast to the freezing cold he had suffered in the real world. Could this be the path to heaven? But just as he reached for it, the golden light shifted. Its warmth turned menacing, its glow deepening into an ominous crimson. Heaven wasn't supposed to be red. Before he could react, the light betrayed him. The moment he reached out, an unspeakable force took hold of him, and suddenly, his body, if it could even be called that anymore, was being torn apart. Limbs shredded, flesh ground into nothing. His very essence was being put through a meat grinder. Nothing ever went well for this man. His screams filled the dark void as the crimson light devoured him completely, piece by piece, atom by atom. He felt every moment of his destruction, every fragment of himself being scattered into nothingness. And then, he woke up. Cold sweat drenched his body as he shot upright, screaming like his life depended on it. The pain still lingered, seared into his very being. He had been seduced into closing his eyes, bonked on the head for being too damn gullible, betrayed, brutally killed, sent into an empty void, shredded apart on an atomic level. And now, he had no idea where the hell he was. Han Feng looked around, his eyes adjusting to the bright sunlight streaming through his balcony. The air felt fresh, lifting the curtains gently as it flowed into his clean, comfortable room. His bed was soft, untouched, and everything around him seemed peaceful, far removed from the cruel world he had grown used to. He sat there for a long time, taking in the sight, trying to process everything that had happened to him in the past few hours. It took him 30 full minutes to absorb it all, but in that time, he allowed himself to revel in the perfect view of the residential area outside his apartment. What he couldn't get over was the sunlight. It was shining again, warm against his skin. He had missed it. The warmth, the golden glow, the simple comfort of daylight. For so long, he had thought he would never feel this again. But here it was, wrapping around him like an old friend. He checked the date, his heart pounding. June 28th. As far as he could remember, the Ice Age apocalypse was supposed to begin on July 15th. He had been ambushed and killed in his previous life, but somehow, he was here again. Alive. Half a month before the end of civilization. It didn't take long for reality to settle in. He had been reborn, given a second chance. Not only did he retain the memories of his previous life, but something else felt different this time. Something strange was happening inside his body, something that seemed to have manifested in his hands. Ever since he woke up, his right hand had been wrapped in a faint red glow. He had tried wiping it off, shaking it away, even waving his hand in the air, but nothing made it disappear. It didn't hurt. In fact, it only felt warm. But aside from the light, it didn't seem to do anything else. At first, he thought he was imagining things. He had been lost in thought on the balcony for so long that the morning breeze eventually made him sneeze. As he wiped his nose, something strange caught his attention. The red glow on his right hand had mysteriously turned green. And then, before he could even process that, something happened that made his heart drop. His hand, still wrapped in that eerie green light, started to change. It was growing, lengthening, stretching as if his bones, flesh, and skin were expanding beyond their natural limits. Panic shot through him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. Fear and confusion took over. And without thinking, Han Feng rushed back into his room, slamming the balcony door shut behind him. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling rapidly. But as soon as he was inside, his hand returned to its normal size. The green glow, however, remained. It lingered, unwavering, as if it had an endless supply of energy. He stared at it helplessly. Beams of light flickered from his palm, shooting out unpredictably. How was this even possible? How would modern science explain something like this? First, his hand had grown longer, and now, right in front of his eyes, it was slowly shrinking. The green light was erratic, unstable. It shifted unpredictably, unlike the red one that had stayed still before. But even though it was still a mystery, sitting down on his couch, Han Feng suddenly felt a pang of unbearable exhaustion. He hadn't done much aside from running back inside, yet his body felt completely drained. This had to be connected to the strange green light. Frustrated, he started swinging his arms all over the place, trying to get some kind of clue as to what was happening. Then, it hit him. Wasn't this just like the manhwa stories he loved reading? A sudden wave of excitement rushed through him. Without wasting a second, he sprinted to the kitchen and grabbed the sharpest knife he could find. In those stories, the protagonist always started by being reborn, often gaining cheat-like powers. Maybe, just maybe, he was experiencing the same thing. If he really had some kind of power, he had to test it out. Posing dramatically with the knife, he waited. Any second now, something incredible would happen. But nothing did. After a few minutes of standing there like an idiot, Han Feng scratched his head in embarrassment. The knife didn't react, and the mysterious light in his hand didn't change at all. He had been so caught up in the idea of gaining cheat-like powers that he completely ignored his exhaustion, and more importantly, the loud rumbling of his stomach. Reality hit him hard. He was starving. Unfortunately, the past Han Feng, who had been blissfully unaware of the impending apocalypse, was also an incredibly lazy guy who never bothered to keep proper food in his fridge. He opened it anyway, hoping for a miracle. Nothing. Not a single piece of edible food. This was bad. He had never felt this hungry before, and if he didn't eat something soon, he would probably pass out. His eyes darted toward the living room. There, sitting quietly on the table, was a clear jar of roasted soybean snacks. Leftovers from before the apocalypse. It wasn't much, definitely not a full meal, but it would have to do for now, just enough to hold him over until he could make a trip to the supermarket. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed one of the roasted soybeans with his right hand, momentarily forgetting about the eerie green light wrapped around it. Hunger overpowered all other thoughts, and without hesitation, he tossed the soybean into his mouth. The moment it hit his tongue, a smoky explosion erupted right in his face. Thick fog billowed out, covering his entire upper body in an instant. Han Feng coughed, waving his hand through the mist, but what shocked him the most wasn't the explosion. It was the fact that he was now chewing on something completely different. A beanstalk. The roasted soybean had sprouted inside his mouth. He could feel tiny roots pressing against his tongue. and the stalk itself had extended outward, still growing. Panicking, he yanked it out, leaving behind an earthy taste in his mouth. Out of all the bizarre events he had experienced lately, this one was definitely near the top. Just moments ago, he was about to snack on some roasted soybeans, and now this. Strangely, he didn't feel tired anymore. It was as if that explosion on his face had erased the hunger he had been feeling. Looking down at his right hand, he noticed that the green light had vanished. Maybe this was connected to whatever had just happened with the soybean. To test it, he plucked a pod from the stalk and examined it closely. Splitting open the lush green shell, he found nothing unusual, just an ordinary, fresh bean sprout. But if that was the case, then what exactly had just occurred? Could this be the power he had been daydreaming about? No matter the cause, one thing was certain. This was an incredible discovery, something worth studying further. But there was no time for research when the more pressing issue was survival. Food was still a necessity, and with the end of the world looming, he had bigger concerns. Stocking up on supplies was the priority. For the first time in a long while, Han Feng stepped out of his apartment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin and listening to the birds singing in the sky. The streets of the commercial district were bustling with life. People going about their daily routines instead of locking themselves indoors in fear of the cold. It felt surreal. Han Feng walked with deep contemplation, replaying everything in his mind. First, the red glow around his hand had changed to green. That green light, shrinking and expanding, had made his heart race and drained his energy. Then, when he touched the soybean snacks, they had suddenly sprouted into a full-grown stalk. None of it made sense. Staring at his right hand, he was left with more questions than answers. What kind of power had been bestowed upon him? And more importantly, by whom? Lost in thought, he continued his walk, his pace unhurried, until a familiar voice called his name. A sweet voice, one that in the past might have made his heart melt. But now, it only made his blood boil. Han Feng didn't recognize it right away, but when he turned around, his expression darkened. Standing before him, flashing a wide smile, was the last person he ever wanted to see. Lee Hyona, the same evil which had led him to a brutal death. Her makeup was flawless, perfectly concealing the rotten personality beneath. She tilted her head slightly, her voice dripping with sweetness as she asked if Han Feng was out shopping too. She even employed her expert witch tricks, appearing as breathtakingly pretty as humanly possible, as if fate itself had brought them together in this place. But Han Feng hadn't even fully processed everything that had happened yet. And now, seeing Lee Hyona here, out in the wild, was starting to stir up the bitterness he had carried with him until his final breath. For 3 long years, she had been the goddess of his dreams. Han Feng had done everything, bent over backward, drained his wallet dry, humiliated himself, all just to make her happy. And for what? To be nothing more than a walking ATM. No, not even that. He wasn't in the friend zone. He was in the pay and leave zone. And to top it all off, she was the very reason he had ended up dead. Han Feng pinched himself hard, forcing himself to stay grounded and calm. This wasn't the time to act recklessly. Revenge could wait. First, he needed to handle a much more immediate problem: his supplies. If he didn't want to end up miserable and starving in this new ice age, he had to focus on survival first. Meanwhile, Lee Hyona had stepped closer, waving a delicate hand in front of his face. She pouted, teasingly asking what he was spacing out for. This had never happened before. There was a time when just hearing her voice would have been enough to make him weak in the knees. But not anymore. Swallowing down his hatred, Han Feng forced a smile, carefully crafting the mask he needed to wear. He chuckled and apologized, claiming he was simply speechless because of how stunning she looked today. She was just so radiant, he admitted, that he had gotten a little lost in the moment. Now, that was more like it. Lee Hyona let out a coy laugh, tilting her head ever so slightly. When had he gotten so smooth with his words? A confident smirk tugged at her lips. She thought she had him right where she wanted, eating from the palm of her hand, just like before. Encouraged by the response, she decided to go for the heart kill shot. Striking the most adorable pose in her arsenal, she playfully invited Han Feng to go shopping together. After all, they had already run into each other. But Han Feng had already reached his limit. There was only so much time he could stand in front of her without losing control of his rage. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, brushing past her as he casually apologized. They wouldn't be doing any shopping together today. Lee Hyona froze. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had expected to get some free stuff from a pathetic simp, not be brushed off like this. Watching her stunned reaction, Han Feng couldn't help but acknowledge that her techniques were still as sharp as ever. But he wouldn't fall for them again. He wouldn't let himself be used as a personal ATM anymore. He wasn't that foolish. With his mind set, he walked straight toward the one place where he could get everything he needed, Waldemar Shopping Plaza. This place was the largest and most well-stocked supermarket in the entire eastern region. It was like Walmart, but of course, that brand was copyrighted. Of course, when the Ice Age hits, this place will be wiped out overnight. In the previous timeline, no one ever figured out who was responsible or how it happened. But Han Feng wasn't concerned about that right now. He was too busy with his shopping spree. He had already filled up one cart with supplies and needed to stock up as much as possible before society crumbled under the sheer cold. Scrolling through some internet forums, he checked a few generic apocalypse survival guides, and surprisingly, they were quite useful. He made a list of essentials: food, winter clothes, medicine, daily necessities, fuel, tools, transportation, and even weapons. There was a lot to prepare, and his excitement over gathering supplies had almost made him forget the real problem at hand: his personal wallet. His current balance was a measly 15,000 yuan, barely over 2,000 US dollars. How was he supposed to secure a safe and comfortable life in the icy apocalypse with such little money? He needed way more cash. Just as he was racking his brain for a solution, a notification popped up on his phone. It was from an organization called Money Jar Loans, congratulating him on his approved eligibility to take out a loan of up to 168,000 yuan, over 23,000 US dollars. A light bulb went off in his mind. There was no need to panic about funds. How could he have forgotten? Thanks to modern technology, he had an infinite money glitch at his disposal. There were dozens of lending apps that required minimal verification to approve loans, preying on those desperate for cash. Normally, getting buried in debt would be a nightmare, but in his case, it didn't matter. Once the apocalypse hit, there would be no one left to collect. Meanwhile, over in the commercial district, a frustrated woman angrily kicked an empty soda can down the curb. Her mood was foul, her eyes burning with irritation. It was none other than Lee Hyona, and today, one of her many devoted simps had actually dared to refuse her. She had gotten all dolled up, expecting to be spoiled, but instead, Han Feng had just taken off without even letting her drain his bank account. Her anger festered. What kind of pathetic loser ditches a girl like her? Especially one who doesn't even own a car. She vowed never to be nice to that worthless idiot again. Just as she was stewing in her frustration, a loud honk snapped her out of it. She turned to see a sleek, brand-new truck rolling up the street, fresh out of the dealership. It was still shining under the sunlight, looking premium in every way. The windows rolled down, and to her surprise, Han Feng was in the driver's seat. He had just pulled up, casually greeting her as if he had just happened to pass by. The moment her eyes landed on the vehicle, her earlier vow dissolved into thin air. The only thing she could see now were those luxurious leather seats and the smell of money. Han Feng stepped out, and when she asked if the car was his, he casually confirmed it. He even threw in an extra detail, claiming that he had just bought it earlier today. Curious, she pressed further, and without missing a beat, he spun a story about how his father had been killing it in business over in the United States, sending him a hefty amount of cash to splurge. He even added that he had just come from the airport after dropping his old man off. The moment she heard that, Lee Hyona's expression lit up. If his father was that wealthy, then this was an opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. Taking a deep breath, she put on her best performance. For the second time today, she lowered her gaze, her body trembling lightly. Knowing that Han Feng had taken his wealthy father to the airport, she suddenly became remorseful, apologizing for asking him to go shopping earlier when she didn't know he had such an important schedule. Then, right on cue, the tears welled up in her eyes. She sniffled, meekly telling him that she had felt abandoned and thought he was ditching her as a friend. Han Feng smirked, thoroughly entertained. If it were the old him, this Academy Award-worthy act might have worked. But now, he saw right through it. This girl was a professional manipulator. Without hesitation, he played along, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her closer. His other hand gently tilted her chin upward, locking eyes with her. Lee Hyona stiffened for a moment, startled by how bold he was acting. She had always seen Han Feng as one of her devoted simps, never someone this confident. But Han Feng wasn't done yet. With a smile laced with charm, he assured her that he would never ditch someone as important as her. For the briefest moment, an imperceptible twisted smile flickered across Lee Hyona's face, but she quickly wiped it away, returning to her sweet, sincere act. This time, she pulled out the big guns. She confessed that Han Feng was actually pretty special to her too. To prove it, she invited him out. Lunch, a movie, anything to get to know him better. Just as she was about to ask for his answer, poof, Han Feng was gone. Like the wind, he had vanished without a trace. She stood there, stunned. Her heartfelt confession, her perfectly executed act, had been directed at nothing but thin air. Han Feng was already tinkering with the piles of boxes stacked in the back of his truck, grumbling playfully about how he still had to carry so many things despite his busy schedule. His complaints, however, were just for show. He didn't mind the work as much as he made it seem. Meanwhile, Lee Hyona, clearly frustrated that her earlier attack had failed, tried her best to maintain her sweet and composed demeanor. She asked why he had bought so much stuff, her voice carrying a forced curiosity. Han Feng, without missing a beat, brushed it off, saying that this amount was nothing special, just some things he liked. But then, to torment the witch even further, he threw in a blatant lie, enthusiastically telling her that he even got a present for her. Not wanting to show too much interest, Hyona simply smiled and waved goodbye as she turned to leave. She walked in the direction of her home, throwing out a casual remark about looking forward to the so-called gift. But the moment her back was turned to Han Feng, a sly smile crept onto her lips. In her mind, she had successfully handled her piggy bank yet again. On the other hand, Han Feng was simply enjoying the game, messing with the witch for his own amusement. Knowing her nature, he was well aware that he couldn't let her, or anyone else, find out about his growing stockpile of supplies. After all, everything he had gathered was his key to surviving the incoming apocalypse. Lee Hyona would just have to wait for her turn. When the world fell apart, Han Feng would make sure she got exactly what she deserved. And that mystery guy who had bashed him on the head, he wasn't off the hook either. His anxiety about the inevitable collapse of society had long since faded. Instead, an odd sense of anticipation had taken its place. Han Feng was actually starting to look forward to what was coming. The next day arrived, June 29th. Again, the date July 15th loomed in his mind. That would be D-Day, the beginning of the end. First, the heavy snow would arrive, blanketing the world in white. Then, the temperature would drop at an alarming rate, plunging to minus 20 degrees Celsius within a month. But that was only the beginning. The cold would continue to creep in, day after day, until the world reached a deadly minus 70 degrees Celsius. By then, everything would be encased in ice and snow, making it nearly impossible to even step outside. Han Feng had already secured his most important resource, food. His stockpile was massive, but it wasn't just about quantity. Everything had to be packed and sealed properly. The last thing he needed was for his nosy neighbors to suspect that he was hoarding supplies. Some of the more sensitive items had to be moved at night when no one was around. He didn't trust anyone enough to help, so he had to do all the work himself. Once the apocalyptic ice age began, the power grid would become extremely unstable. That's where his newest purchase came in, a heavy-duty generator, paired with enough fuel to keep it running for at least a year. With electricity secured, his next priority was heating. If the building's heating system failed, the consequences would be fatal. To prevent that, he called in specialized contractors to modify his home, ensuring it had independent heating. While he was at it, he also ordered reinforced doors and windows. He needed a dedicated storage space for his supplies, so he converted an empty bedroom into a stockpile room. By the time he had checked off everything on his carefully detailed survival notebook, the date was already July 14th. Just one more day before the temperature plummeted and chaos took over. The only thing left on his list was the one task he had been postponing, the main event. It was finally time to sit down and study his mysterious ability. That evening, Han Feng made himself a home-cooked meal, his mind occupied with thoughts of survival. Even with all his preparations, he knew that relying solely on stockpiled supplies wouldn't be enough. Sooner or later, things would get tough. But he had one potential answer, his strange ability to manipulate plants. If he could master it, it might be his only hope for long-term survival in the frozen world to come. The meal he cooked featured soybeans as its main ingredient, the very same beans he had conjured from a single roasted snack using his mysterious ability. He had spent hours racking his brain, trying different gestures and possible triggers, yet the lights hadn't appeared again. The activation seemed so random that finding the right trigger felt nearly impossible. But for now, there was a more immediate concern. Was the food he had conjured even edible? Who would have thought that tasting a few beans could feel so nerve-wracking? Han Feng hesitated before taking his first bite. Slowly, he worked his way through half a plate of beans, carefully monitoring his body for any strange reactions. But nothing happened. Even the soy milk he had made passed both the taste and safety tests. As he chewed on his meal, a realization struck him. His ability could provide edible food. This was a game changer. If he could spawn food reliably, survival would become significantly easier. But the real challenge lay ahead. He still had no control over the red and green lights. If he wanted to truly harness this ability, he needed to find a way to make them appear at will. So far, he had only experimented with soybeans. But what if he tried it on other things? Stealing his resolve, Han Feng opened his newly stocked fridge, determined to push his limits. The next few hours blurred together as he tested his power on various plants, running experiments from midday until the sun had nearly set. He had no idea how much time had passed, only that at some point, exhaustion had overtaken him. When he finally stirred, he found himself lying on the floor, his fingers gripping something tightly. As he forced his tired eyes open, he realized what it was, a massive broccoli. Slowly, he pulled himself up, barely registering the chaotic mess his kitchen had become. His head throbbed violently, a pounding sensation hammering against his skull. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper. He made a mental note. His ability came with a heavy toll on both his mind and body. If he pushed himself too far, he would black out and wake up with a splitting migraine every time. Shakily, he reached for a spoonful of his conjured beans, forcing himself to refuel. He had definitely pushed himself to the limit today, but at least he had uncovered something vital about his ability. Before blacking out, he had neatly arranged a variety of produce on the kitchen floor, experimenting with different crops. Some, like potatoes, showed no reaction to the green light at all. For some unknown reason, they remained unchanged. But not everything was a failure. Certain plants, like soybean stalks and wheat, grew from mere seeds into full-blown crops. Others reacted in a completely unexpected way. Instead of growing or staying the same, they exploded in his hands like miniature bombs. The first time it happened, Han Feng had been completely caught off guard. After the explosion, the plants didn't simply disappear. Instead, they transformed into a strange, coal-like substance, black, lightweight, and inedible. This was certainly an unexpected development, but after some quick tests, he found a use for them. When placed in a container and lit up, these blackened remains worked just like coal, providing a reliable heat source. Coming from a future where warmth was a luxury, Han Feng didn't hesitate to collect them. He might have lost a few crops, but in return, he had gained something equally valuable, an alternative fuel source. No more worrying about staying warm in the coming days. Despite the occasional successes, most of his attempts ended in failure. Each time a plant exploded, he simply tossed another blackened chunk into a growing pile. But then, as he moved on to a batch of store-bought seeds, he decided to take a different approach. This time, he focused entirely on his breathing, forcing himself into a meditative state. Minutes passed, sweat dripping down his face as he concentrated with all his might. And then, just as he reached his limit, something incredible happened. A massive broccoli materialized in his grasp. For a brief moment, he stared at it in shock, hardly believing what he had just accomplished. But before he could process it further, his vision blurred, and his consciousness gave out. As he collapsed onto the floor, one final thought crossed his mind. His success rate was still far too random. Then his body hit the floor. Thankfully, he was already sitting on the tiles when he lost consciousness, so at least the fall wasn't too brutal. Now that he was awake, and with a belly full of beans, he absent-mindedly played around with a piece of broccoli while deep in thought. He had spent all this time trying to figure out a pattern in his ability, but so far, nothing made sense. Still, he couldn't just give up. There had to be some kind of logic behind it. Even though there were still too many unknowns, today wasn't a total loss. He had made some decent progress. At least now, he had some understanding of the activation conditions. Who would have thought that the key to triggering this bizarre ability lay in his very own consciousness? All he had to do was enter a meditative trance. His method? Simple. He imagined himself out in nature, stripped of all human constraints. In other words, buck naked in his mind palace, walking barefoot on the soft soil, feeling the earth beneath his soles, basking under the warm sunlight as life around him thrived in perfect harmony. Just like Adam in the Garden of Eden, his body and mind became one with nature, resonating with the pulse of all living things. And once he reached that state of mind, he slowly opened his eyes. Sure enough, that familiar green glow appeared once again. This ability of his was directly connected to his consciousness. Working from that concept, he realized he could now freely summon the green light. With all the plant samples tested, albeit with a depressingly low success rate, it was time to switch things up. For the second round of experiments, he was going to try something different. Meat. He picked up a juicy slab, his right hand still wrapped in that eerie green glow, and carefully moved it toward the surface. He already had a bad feeling about this, but still, it was disappointing when nothing happened. Maybe the green light only worked on plants? Still, he wasn't giving up just yet. If the gentle approach wasn't doing the trick, then maybe a firmer one would. Grabbing the meat with both hands, he squeezed it with all his might, practically willing his right hand to do something magical. Several minutes passed. Nothing. Defeat was written all over his face. The tired, dejected look of a man who had just squeezed raw meat like a stress ball for science and gotten absolutely nothing in return. That was when a thought hit him. Back when he was meditating, he had sensed two distinct colors, green and red. He had only been using the green light so far, but what if he was missing something? Grasping the primary trigger function of his ability, he focused on a new objective. This time, instead of calling forth the green light, he concentrated on the red one. Still holding the meat, he closed his eyes and reached deep into his consciousness, searching for the dormant power hidden within his system. After a little while, a spark of red light finally flickered to life on Han Feng's right hand. With that tiny spark, the glow rapidly spread, wrapping around his entire hand. And surprisingly, the piece of meat he was holding. It didn't just stop there, though. The moment the light touched the meat, a bubbling reaction erupted across its surface, as if the poor thing had just been tossed into some forbidden alchemist cauldron. A few seconds of intense concentration later, Han Feng opened his eyes, only to be greeted by a truly abominable sight. What was once a decent chunk of meat had transformed into a hardened, dark red sludge. A thing so putrid-looking it could have been a rejected horror movie prop. The moment the red light faded, he instinctively flung the disgusting lump onto the ground, utterly repulsed. And honestly, who wouldn't? If something you were holding suddenly morphed into a demonic meat puddle, you wouldn't be keeping it in your hands either. But as gross as it looked, Han Feng wasn't about to let a potential discovery go to waste. Swallowing his disgust, he crouched down to observe the strange substance more closely. He poked it. Squish. Oh, so that's the texture, huh? The way the meat reacted to the red light was interesting. Revolting, yes, but still interesting. It wasn't just breaking down, it almost seemed cooked. But if all the red light could do was heat things up, that wasn't exactly groundbreaking. Stoves existed, pans existed, and they could produce way better meals than whatever this abomination was. Han Feng refused to believe that was all there was to it. Activating his abilities again, he focused harder, trying to understand what this power was truly doing. The sensation of the red light felt eerily familiar, almost like a disintegration process. With that realization in mind, he moved on to his next experiment, determined to get clearer results. And sure enough, his second attempt turned out far better than the first, meaning he might actually be onto something. Now, for the real test. He grabbed a handful of soybeans from his bean pile and clenched them tightly in his right hand. Meanwhile, in his left hand, he held the red light-infused meat. If the green light represented evolution, then did that mean the red light was its opposite, disintegration? The thought was wild, but there was only one way to find out. With both forces in his hands, he pushed them together. The reaction was instant. A brilliant, blinding flash exploded between his palms, far stronger than anything he had expected. When the light finally faded and his vision cleared, he looked down at his hands. And there it was. His meat had gotten bigger. The meat had been supersized, no doubt about it. But hold on, where did the soybeans in his right hand go? Han Feng squinted at the massive slab before him. Could it be that the two ingredients merged? Did he just create some mutant super meat? Intrigued, he meticulously inspected his creation. No matter how he looked at it, this thing was incredible. It looked, felt, and even smelled just like real meat, except somehow even fresher. This was next-level stuff. With a newfound sense of confidence, he figured he was really getting the hang of this whole superpower deal. And so, naturally, he dove into more experiments. Hours later, his kitchen looked like a war zone. Charred remains of meat and crops were scattered everywhere, the smell of burnt failure lingering in the air. With a frustrated groan, Han Feng finally snapped, throwing a full-blown tantrum. Everything he tried had failed miserably. After getting all that exasperation out of his system, He sat up, took a deep breath, and accepted defeat for now. He could always take his time figuring out the deeper intricacies of this strange ability later. No need to rush genius. Despite the bitter and charred ending to his day, he had still made progress. And, more importantly, he could see his future. If he could just master this power, there was no doubt in his mind. He would be the man standing at the very pinnacle of this post-apocalyptic world. Infinite resources, ultimate survival, and of course, he could make sure his future self had some sweet muscles while he was at it. But speaking of survival, food alone wasn't going to cut it. Sure, he could conjure up meals, but what good was all this loot if he couldn't protect it? He was completely vulnerable without a proper weapon. Realizing this, Hanfeng quickly gathered the scattered crops from his floor. He had to hurry. Time was running out. A quick glance out the window confirmed his worst fear. Snow had begun falling from the sky. It was here. The average person might just think this was a normal snowy evening. But it wasn't. Just like in his previous timeline, this wasn't a winter wonderland. This was the beginning of the end. The collapse of modern civilization had officially begun. Stepping outside, Hanfeng couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The temperatures were expected to drop to 45 below within the week. If he didn't get a gun soon, he'd be in serious trouble. But there was one tiny problem. Buying a gun in this country was completely illegal, and it's not like he had any underground connections. So what now? That's when his ears caught onto a loud voice nearby. A man was boasting to a passerby, practically shouting about how he was a big shot in construction, with millions riding on every project. He wasn't just bragging. He was making sure everyone around knew he had connections to Lao Wang from the Shigong Lida group. According to him, they were so close, they were practically brothers. Hanfeng glanced over and immediately recognized the guy. Of course it was him, a bleach-haired thug with a questionable sense of fashion, dripping in fake-looking jewelry, wrapped up in over-the-top streetwear, and for some reason, always offering people cigarettes. Around here, people called him Homeless Joe. Not that Homeless Joe was his real name. He went by Li Zi, but he loved being called Brotherly. He lived in Han Feng's neighborhood and was supposedly in charge of contracting projects. In reality, though, the guy had no real job. He just liked to act busy. He was always on the move, pretending to negotiate multi-million-dollar deals over the phone, making sure everyone within earshot heard just how successful he was. Despite being a complete deadbeat, Hanfeng figured Joe, Brotherly, probably had the right connections to help him out. Taking a deep breath, Hanfeng approached him, putting on his most awkward yet friendly smile. He greeted Brotherly like an old friend, waving as if they hadn't seen each other in ages. Brotherly, however, didn't seem impressed. He squinted at Hanfeng, clearly trying to recall if they had ever met before. If they had, it definitely wasn't memorable enough for him to care. Sensing the hesitation, Hanfeng quickly introduced himself as Xiao Han, a respectful way of calling himself Little Bro, and insisted that they had met before, maybe a while ago. Brotherly didn't seem entirely convinced, but shrugged it off, muttering something about being swamped with work lately. Too many projects, too many numbers in his head. Couldn't be blamed for a bad memory. Of course, Hanfeng knew better. The guy was probably just swamped with fake business calls. Still, at least he was willing to chat. Hanfeng hesitated for a moment. He was about to ask for something very illegal, and he had no idea how Brotherly would react. Glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping, he finally leaned in and got straight to the point. He needed a gun. The reaction was immediate. Brotherly visibly stiffened, his whole body tensing as he took a step back. His first instinct was disbelief, demanding to know why in the world Hanfeng would need that of all things. It wasn't exactly the reaction Hanfeng had hoped for. A wave of guilt crept up on him, but there was no turning back now. He needed this. Brotherly, however, suddenly grew serious. His usual bragging and playfulness disappeared. He made it clear that his organization didn't engage in any illegal activities, especially something as dangerous as weapons. But despite the firm stance, there was an unspoken implication in his words. That kind of thing was serious, and not something ordinary people should be mixed up with. Hanfeng barely managed to push the thug's questionable Louis Vuitton bag out of his face before clarifying that Brotherly had it all wrong. He wasn't trying to get into anything shady. He was just inquiring about a firearm for self-defense. That's all. Of course, he couldn't just leave it at that. So, naturally, he started lying his ass off. On the spot, he spun a completely made-up story. According to him, it all started one day when he was riding his bike to work like usual. Out of nowhere, he ran into this nasty old man who was casually spitting everywhere, right in the middle of the bike lane. Gross, right? But wait, it gets worse. The wind carried one of those disgusting globs of spit right in Han Feng's face. At that point, he had seen enough. In pure rage, he tossed his bike aside and confronted the old geezer. But instead of apologizing, the absolute menace had the audacity to spit on him again. That was it. Han Feng had no choice. He had to deliver some good old-fashioned street justice. Right there, in the middle of the road, he taught that old man a lesson. With a whole crowd watching, the guy left the scene with tattered clothes, a bruised face, and burning humiliation. But before he scurried away, he swore he'd get revenge. And, well, he wasn't kidding. The very next day, the old man was back, this time patched up and waiting for Han Feng on his usual bike route. But he didn't come alone. Nope, he had goons. What followed was not a proud moment for Han Feng. They jumped him, badly. His clothes were ruined, his face was bruised, his body was aching. He had never been so humiliated in his life. And that, right there, was why he needed a weapon. For self-defense. That was the long and short of it. Well, mostly long, but it seemed like an effective story. Brotherly was fuming. Just the thought of that disgusting old man spitting all over the streets had him seeing red. That wasn't even a main point of Han Feng's story, but hey, if outrage was what got him results, he wasn't going to complain. With a dramatic pat on the shoulder, Brotherly reassured him. This vendetta? Consider it handled. He'd call his big brother right now and get that gun. No problem at all. Han Feng wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or deeply concerned. Before he could think too much about it, Brotherly was already inviting him to the station so they could hop on the bus together. His excuse? His Panamera was in the shop for servicing, so he couldn't drive to the headquarters. Han Feng blinked, then casually pointed to his own car, parked right there on the side. Instantly, Brother Lee's entire demeanor shifted. His eyes locked onto the brand new vehicle, and suddenly, all that tough talk took a back seat. The entire drive to his so-called big brother's place, he couldn't stop gushing about how Han Feng was living the good life. The dude went full interrogation mode, demanding to know how much the car cost. The answer? 700,000 of borrowed money. But of course, Han Feng didn't exactly advertise that part. Meanwhile, Brotherly was busy snapping pictures of himself in the luxury leather seats. His social media handle, Handsome Spicy Guy, was about to be updated with the most delusional flex of the night. As Han Feng followed his directions, left turn at the next intersection, Brotherly casually captioned his latest post. Something about how his SUV's seats were still too hard because they were too new. By the time they finally pulled up, the scenery had taken a turn for the worse. They were now in one of the seedier parts of the city. Outside, a group of rough-looking guys had gathered, grumbling about the ridiculous weather. And honestly, who could blame them? It had skipped straight from summer to a brutal winter overnight. No warning, no transition, just straight-up suffering. Their complaints were cut short when a sleek-looking set of wheels rolled up. All eyes turned toward the car, curious to see who was about to step out. The moment they recognized Li Ziyi, their interest skyrocketed, and they rushed toward him, eager for some news. Brotherly, ever the smooth talker, casually mentioned that he had some business to handle with Boss Lu. That was all it took for the other thugs to make their own assumptions. Their eyes darted back to the brand new Tiger SUV, and before long, they were hounding him about the price. Now, did he own the car? Absolutely not. Did he deny their assumption? Not even a little. Instead, he puffed out his chest and proudly declared that he had dropped a cool 700 grand on it. Han Feng, standing nearby, couldn't even be mad at the sheer level of shamelessness. Bragging about a car that isn't yours while the real owner is literally standing right there? That's next-level confidence. Once they stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. Boss Lu, a man who practically radiated hardcore gangster energy, came out, clearly annoyed that Brotherly had the audacity to bother him this late. Lee, who had been acting all big and bold outside, suddenly toned it way down, even offering the boss a cigarette like a polite little office intern. Boss Lu, however, was not in the mood for small talk. He was a busy man, and he made that very clear. Without wasting time, Brotherly introduced Han Feng as a buyer of something special. The moment the words left his mouth, Boss Lu narrowed his eyes. Did he just hear that right? His gaze shifted to Han Feng, who immediately stiffened under the intense scrutiny. One wrong move, one wrong word, and he had no idea what might happen next. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Boss Lu just stared, cigarette dangling from his lips, looking Han Feng over from head to toe. Then, just when the tension was about to snap, Boss Lu smirked. Turns out, He was actually disappointed. He had been expecting something interesting, but all Han Feng wanted was a measly gun? Boring. Without another word, he gestured toward one of his guys, Chong Zi. The henchman knew the drill. Digging into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a pistol and casually tossed it onto the table. Boss Lu didn't even flinch as he named the price, 6,000. Easy to conceal, reliable, and just what Han Feng needed. Right? Apparently not. Han Feng hesitated before politely declining. A handgun wasn't really what he had in mind. He needed something bigger, something longer, something that required a scope to fire. The entire room went dead silent. Boss Lu's expression darkened as his gaze bore into Han Feng. And just like that, our boy realized he might have just crossed a serious line. Without another word, he shut his mouth so fast, it was as if he had swallowed his own tongue. Then the explosion came. Boss Lu snapped, shouting about how insane it was to casually walk in and demand a freaking sniper rifle like this was some kind of shopping mall. This was a discreet business, not a damn supermarket where you could just pick and choose from an illegal weapon catalog. And just in case Han Feng still wasn't getting the memo, Boss Lu made it crystal clear. His final offer? The pistol on the table. Take it or leave it. Brotherly had to step in before things got messy. The boss wasn't exactly the most patient guy, and convincing him required some serious improvisation. So, in classic Homeless Joe fashion, Lee decided to weave a completely made-up backstory for Han Feng on the spot. Apparently, 5 years ago, Han Feng had a wife. A non-existent wife. Under the relentless snowfall, Brotherly worked his magic, crafting a tragic tale so convincing that the boss sat through the entire thing without interrupting. And the best part? It worked. By the time Lee wrapped up his masterpiece, Boss Lu was fuming. The story must have been next level because he was this close to snapping the table in half. He kept muttering about how disgusting those people were. How dare they do such a thing to Han Feng? According to this new reality, Han Feng had 3 kids. But plot twist, none of them were his. Han Feng, meanwhile, just stood there, silently accepting the absolute nonsense spewing from Lee's mouth. Even for someone nicknamed Homeless Joe, this story was outrageous. But hey, if it worked, who was he to argue? And it worked. Boss Lu, now emotionally invested, gave his personal guarantee. Han Feng would definitely get his sniper rifle. No questions asked. He'd personally make it happen, though it might take a few days. Everything would be arranged through his henchman, Chong Zi. But that wasn't all. Apparently, the boss had gone all in on this newfound brotherhood. Not only was he securing the sniper rifle, but he also wanted Han Feng to be fully prepared. So, just like that, he handed over a handgun, completely free of charge. A gift, man-to-man. Han Feng was speechless. Somehow, through the sheer power of nonsense, Lee had pulled off the impossible. The boss had bonded with Han Feng over a fictional tragedy, and now, here he was, fully armed, no questions asked. With business settled, Boss Lu went back to his phone, handling actual pressing matters. But before they left, Han Feng figured he should return the favor just a little. So, with the most serious look he could muster, he casually mentioned that a buddy of his, someone working for the government, had told him that, due to the abnormal weather, purchase limits on supplies would be implemented soon. Meaning, it was best to stock up now, before it was too late. Boss Lu, despite being a man of the underworld, couldn't ignore how convincing Han Feng sounded. He gave a firm nod, taking the tip very seriously. And with that, Han Feng and Brotherly walked out of the city's underbelly, one firearm secured, and somehow, a completely fabricated past that had just won them a huge favor. On the way back, Lee couldn't stop gloating about how flawlessly he had handled everything. According to him, it was a masterclass in business negotiations like a boss. And now that his big brother, the big boss, was in a great mood, they could probably even ask him for a cannon and get yes. The confidence was off the charts. Han Feng, feeling somewhat grateful despite the headache-inducing bragging, decided to buy the thug some cigarettes as a thank you. Brotherly, of course, tried to be humble, insisting that he did what he did purely out of the goodness of his heart, but then casually mentioned that he'd graciously accept about 7 or 8 cartons of his beloved Huazi cigarettes. He even threw in a promise to take Han Feng to a sauna once he got paid for his latest so-called project. Meanwhile, Han Feng was already planning his next steps. Supplies secured. Weapon obtained. At the very least, he had what he needed for the early days of the apocalypse. Now, he could focus on properly studying his abilities. But if he really wanted to thrive, solving the food problem was going to be key. Long-term survival would skyrocket if he could figure that part out. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the icy patch in his path. One misstep later, and boom, he was airborne. A second later, he crashed to the ground. Pain shot up his leg, and reality hit fast. In all his careful apocalypse planning, he had completely ignored one of the golden rules of an incoming ice age. Don't get injured. Judging by the sharp pain radiating through his leg and the way he landed, there was a very real possibility that something was actually broken. Brother Lee, in a rare moment of concern, rushed over, looking completely lost on what to do. Han Feng, gritting his teeth through the pain, fumbled for his car keys and handed them over, requesting to be taken to the nearest hospital ASAP. But Lee, rubbing the back of his head, hesitantly admitted that there was a small problem. He didn't have a driver's license. Insisted he couldn't drive without one. But let's be real, the dude just couldn't drive, period. At the very least, he didn't abandon Han Feng to writhe in pain on the freezing ground. He tried to lift him up, offering his shoulders for support. But given how much he struggled, it was pretty clear that neither of them was going to make it to the hospital alive at this rate. With no other choice, Han Feng called for a taxi. And of course, he had to pay for it, because Lee, unsurprisingly, was broke as hell. Even the hospital, a place that was supposed to be an essential establishment, was struggling under the intensifying blizzard. Snow was piling up fast, burying the roads, and the whole building was starting to freeze over. Inside, in the nurse's office, someone named Jiyeon was just settling into her night shift. The storm outside was relentless, and the emergency section was severely short-staffed. Unfortunately for her, calls from the hallway were already pouring in. She had barely started her shift, and it was already shaping up to be a long night. After getting an x-ray at the hospital, it was officially confirmed Han Feng had really broken his leg. The doctor pointed to the scan, explaining that there was a stable fracture on his right tibia. Nothing too serious, easy enough to set, but he'd have to stick around for an hour under observation before heading home with his meds. Of course, this little accident couldn't have picked a worse time to happen. The apocalypse was about to kick off in full force, and here he was stuck in a hospital, regretting every careless move that led to this moment. Brother Lee had been with him for most of the process, but of course, the guy had big deals to handle. Probably another multi-million-dollar phone call waiting for him. Still, credit where it's due, the dude was a real one. Before leaving, he made sure to hand Han Feng his number, just in case he needed anything. Now alone in the hospital lobby, Han Feng let out a long, heavy sigh. The situation outside was bad. The blizzard was making things worse by the second, and the hospital was overflowing with accident victims. Emergency beds lined the hallways, a grim sign of just how quickly things were spiraling out of control. But Han Feng had only one goal: grab his meds and get out before the roads closed for good. Just as he was contemplating his life choices, something, or rather, someone, walked right into his field of vision. A goddess. Well, technically it was the head nurse. But in this chaotic, freezing nightmare of a world, she might as well have been divine. Head nurse Jiyeon had arrived to support the overwhelmed emergency staff. Without missing a beat, she moved to the first bed, tending to a patient with severe wounds. Next was bed 5, where a patient had just been treated. Fortunately, vitals were stable. She instructed the attending nurse to administer another dose of glucose in 10 minutes, adding that if the patient's heart rate dropped below 80, epinephrine had to be given immediately. She was all business, moving swiftly through her rounds, her skill and confidence undeniable. Han Feng, however, was completely distracted. Not only was she incredibly competent, but she was also young, far too young to already be a head nurse. A generational talent, no doubt. And on top of that, she was stunning. Even in the middle of a hectic night shift, she handled everything with grace, her smile never fading. She was practically an angel, which is exactly why Han Feng felt just a little bit guilty when his gaze accidentally strayed toward, well, ungentlemanly areas. Realizing what he had done, he immediately looked away out of respect. But seriously, was this woman completely unaware of the effect she had on people? A real airhead, this one. Out of nowhere, the old man sitting beside him suddenly called out to the pretty head nurse. She wasn't really required to tend to patients outside of her rounds, but still, head nurse Jiyeon approached with a polite smile, always the professional. Apologizing sweetly, she explained that she was covering for a staff shortage and needed to prioritize urgent cases, but she promised to check back later. The old man, however, wasn't having it. Complaining about unbearable back pain, he insisted that she take a quick look right now. In reality, this bastard wasn't here for medical care. He was just a filthy old perv trying to film under her skirt. Completely unaware of what was happening, Jiyeon just smiled and apologized again, suggesting that an X-ray might be needed to properly diagnose the issue. But the creep wasn't backing down. He got pushier, urging her to just take a quick look while conveniently pointing to the exact spot where it supposedly hurt. Then, the audacity, he actually got up from his seat and placed his hand on her waist. Being the airhead that she usually was, Jiyeon only laughed, too ticklish to realize what was actually going on. She reminded him, in her usual cheerful tone, that back problems should really be checked by the resident physician. But the old perv took this as an invitation, his hand creeping lower. This disgusting act might have gone on even longer if not for something, or rather someone, that decided enough was enough. A freaking flying crutch came out of nowhere, smashing directly into the old creep's back. If he wanted to complain about back pain before, well, congratulations. Now he had a real reason. The impact knocked his phone straight out of his hands, sending it skidding across the floor. Jiyeon, ever the kind-hearted nurse, instinctively moved to check if the old man was all right. But before she could even react, Han Feng stepped in, humble as ever, apologizing with the utmost sincerity. His crutch, apparently, had accidentally flown to the side. After all, this was his first time using one. What a coincidence. Bending down, Han Feng immediately zeroed in on the phone, casually wondering if it had broken from the fall. The reaction was instant. The perv panicked, sweating bullets as he screamed for Han Feng to stay away from the phone. Bad move. Han Feng, completely ignoring the protests, made his way across the room. His bandage got messed up in the process, but he did not care. There was no way in hell he was letting this revolting leech get away with something this disgusting. And sure enough, the moment he unlocked the phone, his suspicions were confirmed. The proof was right there, on the freaking home screen. Han Feng's gaze slowly lifted, locking onto the old creep. If looks could kill, this geezer wouldn't just be dead. He'd be 6 feet under, with no funeral in sight. This pervert had the audacity to film up the skirt of a hardworking nurse, assault her, and then throw a tantrum when caught. There was no good reason why Han Feng shouldn't just call security right now and have this lowlife escorted straight to jail. Well, let's be honest, pervs like him were taught some very harsh lessons. But Han Feng had a better idea. Tightening his grip on the phone, he made it very clear he was keeping it. And if he ever saw this old creep near this hospital again, he swore he would personally ruin his miserable, disgusting life. The bastard knew he had no choice. The first chance he got, he scrambled up from the hospital floor and bolted for the exit, running like his life depended on it. Because, well, it probably did. Meanwhile, head nurse Jiyeon was left utterly baffled. Just moments ago, that old man had been groaning about severe back pain, yet he had taken off running like an Olympic sprinter. How did that make any sense? Han Feng, on the other hand, had just witnessed what was possibly the most comically naive person he had ever met. He sighed and decided to show her exactly what the old creep had been up to, holding up his phone and recording from an angle that was way too suspicious. Judging by her reaction, she genuinely hadn't noticed a thing. Unbelievable. Without a word, Han Feng handed her the phone, letting her decide whether to delete the footage or turn it over to the cops. He also took the opportunity to remind her to be a little more careful. People like that perv would take advantage of kindness in a heartbeat. Instead of being shaken, she simply flashed a smile as radiant as 1,000 suns. And then, as if nothing had happened, she casually asked, wasn't his leg supposed to be broken? At that moment, it hit him. The adrenaline from catching that old creep had completely numbed the pain in his leg. But now that it was over, the pain came rushing back with a vengeance. He let out a scream of pure agony. Thankfully, head nurse Jiyeon was an expert when it came to these kinds of injuries. She swiftly reset his cast with the skill of a seasoned professional, her hands moving with practiced ease. Once she was done, she looked at him expectantly. Better now, or at least, that was what her expression seemed to say. Han Feng let out a deep breath, grateful that she had fixed up his broken leg. He assured her that the pain was gone, at least for now. For a brief moment, the crowded room seemed to fade away, almost as if only the two of them existed in that space. Jiyeon, still beaming, expressed her gratitude in return. She promised that from now on, she wouldn't let creeps like that get away with their nonsense. In fact, she swore that she'd make sure to punch them really well next time. Han Feng, however, just wanted her to be more aware of her surroundings. A noble thought, but clearly she had learned absolutely nothing. Why? because at that exact moment, she was unintentionally pressing his injured leg against her, completely oblivious to what she was doing. Han Feng could only sigh. Yep, still just as clueless. Before he could say anything, another nurse rushed over, calling for Jiyeon as her help was needed in the emergency section. Before heading back to her rounds, Jiyeon turned back to him one last time, reminding him not to forget his checkup in a week. Han Feng promised he would come back, but deep down, he knew the truth. A week from now? That felt almost impossible. Instead of explaining, he simply smiled helplessly. Taking the crutch he had heroically sacrificed against the old perv, he adjusted his grip and limped his way out of the hospital. And just like that, he accepted the inevitable. He probably wasn't going to see her ever again. The next day arrived, but the blizzard hadn't let up. Not even a little. In fact, it had only grown stronger, practically freezing the entire country's infrastructure in place. Stepping outside had become a full-blown survival mission, and just breathing the icy air felt like a challenge. The morning news was filled with nothing but emergency weather reports. Within the next 24 hours, every region in the country was expected to experience even heavier snowfall and a brutal temperature drop. But it wasn't just happening here. Bizarre reports from overseas revealed that everywhere was getting hit. Dubai, Egypt, the Amazon basin, places that had no business dealing with snowstorms were now buried under thick blankets of white. Scientists, climate experts, and specialists from 46 countries were scrambling to the United Nations, desperate to figure out what in the world was happening. Despite all the chaos, every news channel kept repeating the same reassuring script. This severe cold snap wouldn't last too long. They urged the public to remain calm, avoid spreading rumors, and definitely not start panic buying supplies. Because, of course, the government totally had everything under control. Han Feng, cozy inside his fully decked-out home, couldn't help but click his tongue at the blatant lies. The government and media were feeding the public the same old scripted nonsense, doing whatever it took to keep people from freaking out. If he hadn't already died and come back to life, he might have believed them too. But this time, he knew better. And unlike the clueless masses, he was prepared. His supplies were fully stocked, his house was reinforced, and his heating system was running flawlessly. He had taken every precaution, planned for everything. For now, there was nothing to stress about. Then his phone started buzzing nonstop. The Happy Housing Complex's group chat was blowing up with messages. Everyone was freaking out about the crazy weather, talking about how the roads were already buried in snow and completely unusable. The residents, like the rest of the world, were utterly clueless about what was really happening. But then, amidst all the panic chatter, one message stood out. A user nicknamed Mysterious Person had suddenly taken center stage in the conversation. With eerie confidence, this mystery individual declared that this wasn't just a freak snowstorm. Something inside the Earth itself was causing this unnatural disaster. And then came the bombshell. This wasn't just bad weather. This was the beginning of the Ice Age apocalypse. Han Feng stared at the messages, his mind racing. Who was this mysterious person? And more importantly, how did they know about the apocalypse? Well, guess we'll only find out if you like and subscribe.